Please welcome to the stage The Atlantic's Molly Cox.
Good morning. I'm Molly Cox. I'm Vice President of Partnerships for The Atlantic. We are very happy to have you here with us in person to discuss an issue that's changed all of our lives, the way we work. The future of work has been debated for years, but during the pandemic, it has taken on new meaning. The debate goes far beyond whether we're working in person, remotely, or on a hybrid schedule. Technology has been essential in maintaining employment and product delivery to customers, but are advancements moving us forward or undoing years of progress when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion? Meantime, workers are going on strike, or at least threatening to in larger numbers, as employees demand more flexibility, focus on their wellness, and higher wages to combat inflation. And amidst growing concerns about the economy, companies are cutting expenses to tend to their bottom line. During the next 75 minutes, we will unpack how the decisions made in this moment can impact generations to come. We have a distinguished group of speakers with us who will outline the evolution of the future of work, accountability needed for progress, and best practices needed moving forward. Our hashtag, if you want to join the conversation on social, is TAF22. And we want to thank KPMG for their support in making this important and timely discussion possible. All right, let's get started.
And now, to discuss back to work, creating a new normal, please welcome to the stage Chris Hyams, CEO of Indeed, with Derek Thompson, staff writer at The Atlantic.
Hi everyone, Chris. This is a real thrill to be able to talk to you about one of my favorite subjects to write about. So I want to start by asking you what Indeed knows that everyone else doesn't know. Because if you want to know about the future of work and people's predictions about hybrid and remote and return to office and preferences of bosses and workers, anyone can just Google that and read something in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Bloomberg. But I want to know what your secrets are to kick us off. So what is it that you're seeing in your data that either feels like an Indeed secret or something that somewhat pushes back against some mainstream narratives?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me. It's great to be here with everyone. So the things that we have that are unique, we have 250 million job seekers a month coming to Indeed searching. We have about 25 million jobs. So we have pretty much a front row seat to the global economy, and in particular what people are thinking and looking for as opposed to where they actually are right now. I think one of the narratives, so there's a lot of discussion, we'll probably spend a lot of time talking about this idea of hybrid or remote work. One of the things that we've seen that's very different, so the impact of the recession on women in particular on the pandemic was very different than in previous recessions. So in previous recessions, typically you have seen that the unemployment for men was much more impacted than for women. The sort of interest rate sensitive sectors like construction and manufacturing, impact on women was dramatically different during the pandemic. There's 1 million women who have exited the workforce who don't seem to be coming back. So when we look at this question of remote and hybrid work, one of the things that we're seeing that's really interesting is that for employed men and women, they're searching in relatively equal amounts. Unemployed women are 50% more likely to be searching for remote work than men, and that is typically because the burden of childcare and household activities has been falling on women, and they are much more interested in this flexibility. So this larger conversation about people wanting more flexibility, women are much more interested in this right now.
One of the themes that I hope comes out from our conversation is that preferences for remote or hybrid work are not even, are not universal. There's differences between men and women. There's differences between ages, maybe between psychological profiles, introverts preferring to work in their basement, extroverts being like, get me back to the office. I want to talk about one of the key dichotomies, which is between workers and managers. From your God's eye view at Indeed, what is the difference between what workers seem to be searching for and what managers seem to be posting?
Yeah, so interest in remote work is up across the board, but one of the things that we see that's really different, so you have an increase of about 3x in terms of the number of postings on Indeed that mention remote or hybrid work. From a search perspective, it's up 5x. So it's pretty significant right now. About 16% of all searches in the US right now are for something related to remote work. That is within the lens of only about 35 to 40% of all jobs in the US are even possible for remote. So it's a significant percentage, but the disconnect between the 5x interest and the 3x availability is one of the things that is very clear. There's a bunch of research, and we were talking about this before. Typically speaking, management is interested in bringing people back into the office for productivity. When you ask workers why they want to come back, the reason is social interactions. And so this is really the age-old argument about control. One of the things that we see, and my philosophy in general, is that if you treat people like children, they tend to act like children. And so when you tell people they have to do something, they tend to revolt, even if it's something that might be good for them, like being able to come in occasionally to connect with other folks. So I think that that's going to be something that's going to have to be reckoned with.
For about 150 years, if you were a white-collar worker, a knowledge worker, there was only one option for you, for the most part. It was get your butt to the office. And then for a weird 9-month period, there was an exception to that rule where people weren't allowed in offices, couldn't go into offices if they were white-collar workers, and they had to work from home. But now we're in this weird period where you don't have the black or white choice of office, no office. You have a lot of people trying out hybrid. How is hybrid working out? Because I can imagine there's ways in which the clarity of everyone in the office, no questions asked, and no one in the office, no questions asked, there's a clarity to that. But hybrid seems messy. So what are some of the messes that you're seeing in hybrid right now?
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge is that anyone who looks at what was happening during the pandemic as a clear indicator of what the future looks like is missing the fact that there was no choice and that there was a global crisis going on every single possible dimension. So it wasn't a really fair view. Now, given the fact that a bunch of companies were forced into this experiment and were able to function pretty well, it does suggest that there's something there that people weren't necessarily ready to accept before. So as an employer, I'm interested in the stuff from the God's eye view. I like that perspective, but also as an employer. So we have about 14,000 employees around the world. We sent everyone home on March 3rd, 2020. And from our perspective, what we saw very clearly is, clearly the world was falling apart in a lot of ways. There were a lot of people who were, if you take that anxiety out, who were just missing being around other people. They were people who feed on the energy of other people who needed that collaboration. But also in the software development world, in the technology world, there's a very broad spectrum of different work styles. And we found a handful of people, more than a handful, we found a significant number of people who had been waiting their entire careers to be able to be at home uninterrupted and to work that way. And we're incredibly happy and productive. And so I think the answer is that we need a new word, because hybrid can mean a whole bunch of different things. So are we talking about people sometimes in the office, sometimes not in the office? Are we talking some people are in the office, some people are not? The way that we view it is that any extreme is not going to be the best for everyone. Like you said, for 150 years, we decided there was one way for everyone to work. But if the answer is that some people are going to be way more productive and happy if they're at home, and some people are going to be way more productive and happy in the office, then we want to embrace, as an employer, we're trying to embrace all of that and to create the best environment possible. We have to change a lot how we work in order to enable that, in order to create an environment where some people are in and some people are out.
Can I tell you my anxiety about hybrid work, and then maybe you can respond to it? Thank you for allowing me to therapeutize this situation. So the economist Nick Bloom at Stanford does these surveys of thousands and thousands of workers. And he asks them, how many days would you ideally like to work in the office? And in his latest survey, it found that about 20% of workers said, I don't want to spend any days in the office, 0. About 25% of workers said, I want to spend all 5 days in the office. The rest of them had something in the middle, 2, 3, 4 days in the office. So he said, I think that the best solution here is to have the companies that I advise and I talk to work on a hybrid solution. And I said, I can see how that kind of makes sense, but if I did a survey of, let's say, this audience right here, and I said, how many people prefer chocolate ice cream? And 20% raised your hands. And I said, how many people prefer vanilla ice cream? And 25% of you raised your hands. And I said, okay, chocolate vanilla swirlies for everyone. You'd be like, wait, 45% of this audience just said they did not want that. And I wonder whether the hybrid work solution falls into that category of swirlies for everyone not actually working out.
Yeah, and that's why we might need more than one word to describe it. So I do think that there
Swirlies is not going to be the word, I don't think. I'm not proposing that as the replacement for hybrid.
So Indeed, I think, has a bit of an advantage over some other companies, is that we started in 2004 with 2 co-founders. One was in Connecticut, one was in Austin. And so from day one, most companies start with people sitting around a single table with a single whiteboard. From day one, we had a remote collaboration culture. So we were already ready to some degree to do that. So companies that had never done that before, there's just a million things that you need to figure out. But so, for example, I think there's a lot of research that people are paying to do to prove that remote work doesn't work. So they can say, look, it doesn't work. You can't do creative work. If we put people together in a room, they're going to brainstorm more effectively than people are going to do over Zoom.
In Washington, D.C., we're very used to the idea of, say, a Republican releases a poll that says Republicans are up 3 points in generic ballot, or vice versa for Democrats. So this motivation bias in polling, is pretty familiar.
So there's a bunch of examples. One of my favorite examples, if you take the open source software world, Linux, the Linux operating system was built by a bunch of people in multiple different countries, many of whom never met each other, many of whom never even talked to each other. It was all done through documentation and email, and they built the operating system that runs the entire internet today. But that was an organization that was founded for people to work remotely. So they figured out how to work asynchronously, how to do a really good job of writing. Most companies are not very good at writing things down. They expect to be able to have hallway conversations are great, but hallway conversations also exclude anyone who's not at the hallway at the same time. And so I think that every single business that is going to even consider doing this is going to have to really think what are the factors that are required to make that work. And I think in general that anyone that can embrace that range of things, if you can have both chocolate and vanilla options, you're going to have more people who are happy as opposed to just forcing half the people to take something they don't want.
And I think it's so important to remember that people are different. There is diversity of preferences among people for working around lots of people or working alone. But also, jobs aren't just one thing. They're just a bundle of tasks. And some tasks might be very easily done remotely, asynchronously, just answering email. You can do it at home, you can do it at a coffee shop, you can do it in the office. But there might be other tasks that you kind of have to do in an office, or where it's best for most people in that group to be in the office together when they're doing them. How do you think about sort of breaking down tasks into these categories of okay to be done remotely, and you know what, this is something where I think we really would benefit from having these team members together in the office at the same time?
Yeah, so again, I would come back as a leader of a company and our own employees, I would go back to if you treat people like adults, they're going to act like adults. So instead of me deciding that, having the teams decide what they need is, we think, a more effective approach. If you talk about designing software, if you talk about being a journalist, you need to sit down and have a conversation with someone, and then you need to go off and write. If you're a software developer, you need to be in a room. Brainstorming can be really effective when you get the right people together. You're not brainstorming 95% of the time. You're brainstorming 10% of the time, and then you actually need quiet, very uninterrupted and focused time. And so trying to understand the difference between those roles and the difference between those teams, and not having management say, this is what we need for control reasons. I want to look over your shoulder and make sure you're doing your job. So for us, it's really focusing on outcomes and letting teams figure out what is going to be most effective. One thing that I'll just add is that one of the big things that changed, so anyone here who was working in an office and then was remote and everything was on Zoom and is now sort of in a hybrid world, Zoom needs to change also. So for a long time, we had Zoom, we used Zoom, and we would have 10 people in a conference room in Austin and 5 people in a conference room in Dublin and 5 people in Stamford. And it was a crappy experience, and that's just how it was. And then we went home, and suddenly everyone is a rectangle on a screen, and imperfect in a million different ways. I can see your eyes, I can see your facial expressions, and that's very different. Now we have people coming back in, and so we've got 7 rectangles with faces and one rectangle with 10 people on the far end of the room, and I can't tell what's going on with them. So we have decided that we need to actually completely change how we're doing the collaboration. There's a bunch of really interesting companies with software and hardware that, with those Zoom cameras, can detect faces and put separate rectangles on the screen so you can see the individuals. We also have a lo-fi version of that, which is we just call one face, one screen. Everyone in the room brings their laptop and just puts on Zoom, mutes everything, and it's a hugely different experience. So we're having better remote collaboration between people in different offices because we're learning from what actually worked really well during the pandemic.
My favorite study that's been done on remote work was a study that Microsoft did with the University of Berkeley. And what they essentially had the insight that you've already articulated, which is that the pandemic was a tragedy and it was also an experiment, a forced experiment. And it allowed us to answer a bizarre question, which is, what is the job of an office? If you think of the office as a technology, what does that technology do? What kind of tasks does it make easier and what kind of tasks does it complicate? And Microsoft and Berkeley followed 60,000 workers over a period of 6 months in 2020, and they came to several conclusions about how the pandemic had changed people's behavior when they were forced to work remotely. They found the total number of messages sent was pretty much the same, but the number of messages sent within the group they were working in went way, way up. Suddenly communication within your group soared, and communication outside of your group among people that, that person that maybe you walk by in the office who you don't work with them, but they like the same football team as you do, or maybe even better, they hate the football team that you root for. They're, the Commanders fan versus Giants fan, and you get to gossip with them every Monday about how the Sunday games went. Those relationships totally atrophied. And it made me think that in trying to understand the question of what is it that offices do, I talked to the researchers, I said, how about this theory? There's hard work versus soft work. Hard work is like writing, answering emails, calling people on the phone, filling out a spreadsheet, Excel. It's the kind of work that you can sort of do anywhere. It's asynchronous and you are a busy body while you're doing it. But what offices might be specialized for is soft work. It's not work. It's not totally goofing off, but it's building the kind of psychological safety with people in your office that are just 1 degree away from you, such that when you do need them for a project later, bam, you can get right to it because you trust each other when you throw out a really big, weird idea. So, how do you feel about, I wonder, I don't know if you knew about the Microsoft study, if you were surprised by this idea of sort of in-group communications getting tighter, out-group communications atrophying, and maybe how you feel about this idea of hard versus soft work.
Yeah, so I saw your story on that, so I did actually, that's why I got introduced to that study. That was not surprising at all, that makes sense. And I think what you have is the sort of electronic communications and the in-person communications. They're just going to balance each other out in one way or another. I think, so I have 2 thoughts. The first one is what is the purpose of an office? I think kind of like the is remote or in-person better, an office doesn't mean one thing. It's different things to different people. So when we looked at our own employees, we had salespeople in Tokyo who lived in 750 square foot apartments, who were home with 2 kids, and they were supposed to be on Zoom talking to clients all day. An office for them is an escape. That is a place to be where I can actually just have my own space and think, where for someone else, if you've got a really beautiful apartment with a view of the wharf, that might be your quiet place to think. So it's going to be different. Some people want to come in and be social. Some people need to meet because that's the best way to get information. So I think thinking about it, anytime we try to say, what is the one thing, we're asking the wrong question. I think there's a number of different ways to think about this. So as someone who runs a global company, we have people in 16 countries and 35 different offices. For me, I relied heavily, I spent a lot of time traveling because I really value in person. I would go to offices and do Q&As and go out to lunch with people. As soon as the pandemic started, I just started doing a weekly all-hands Zoom. So we're in different time zones. We can't have 13,000 people on. I'm still doing it now. We're doing it every week now, but so every other week, we're still averaging 6,000 people. I do an all-hands Zoom Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. and I talk for 5 minutes and then do open Q&A. People ask questions on Slido, they vote them up. I am personally, more connected to the entire employee base today because of that than I ever was when I was relying on in-person interactions. I started doing a bunch of other things. I started doing I was doing this before the pandemic, where wherever I was, I would grab 5 people and just go to lunch, random, like we do, literally random sort, pick 5 people from the office. So I started doing that over Zoom. So I have it's either lunch, breakfast, or dinner, depending on where they are in the world. So I'll talk to 5 people in Amsterdam, or talk to 5 people in Tokyo, or 5 people in Seattle. I think it's two-way. I'm definitely more connected to what is on people's minds because of that, but people are hearing from me on a very, very regular basis, and the level of communication and transparency has gone way up. Now that people are coming back in the offices, I'm still doing the all-hands Zooms. And I think that we're learning that there are some things that offices are really great at that are micro, but on the macro, I mean, there's no such thing as a 13,000 person company where everyone is in person and everyone, so again, I'm trying to just take all the things that we learned from this and bring them forward, and I think it's the sort of genius of the and kind of approach.
That's fantastic to hear. I mean, I'm an introvert. I am also a writer. I do think it is fundamentally, like phenomenologically impossible to write socially. Like if you're writing, how can you possibly be talking to someone while words are coming out of your fingers and out of your, like different ones out of your mouth? It just doesn't make any sense, those verbal streams. But at the same time, I try to keep reminding myself about, the diversity of psychological experiences and how there are people who need in-person conversation, in-person interaction at work. And one of the first conversations that I had with any researcher or any thinker about remote work back in March 2020 was someone who had done research for Google. And he told me that one thing that seems to fall away when people work remotely is just a little bit of that concept of psychological safety. That buzzword at Google that now is everyone's buzzword, which basically just means that I trust that if I represent a crazy big idea to you, you won't laugh at my face. And as a result, people feel free to exchange their most heartfelt big ideas. And he said the tough thing about remote is that there's just less data. That I can see how you're sitting, I can see you smile if I say something, I can see you nod. And the example that he gave to me, which is just so true, is if I have a big idea and I propose it to my boss over Slack, and he responds with the letters OK, period. Day over. I'm ruined for the rest of the day. My boss hates me. Oh my God, this idea is terrible. I'm terrible. My ideas are terrible. If the exact same interaction happens face to face, hey, here's an idea about a future direction for my beat. Okay. Same two letters, entirely different vibe. And I wonder, I guess, just as a last question, because I love the fact that you are an advocate for the benefits of remote work. I think that's beautiful. Maybe just think a little bit about what you fear is lost among companies that don't get back to the office.
Yeah, well, maybe let me answer a slightly different question. Just because the psychological safety thing, I think, is super important. We spent a lot of time talking about it. One of the things that happened during the pandemic for us is, so we, like a lot of other companies, have, some call them ERGs, we call them IRGs, Inclusion Resource Groups. Those are, in general, people from marginalized communities, so they're smaller groups. What happened during the pandemic is we would have, a Black inclusion group in Austin and one in Stanford and one in New York. Suddenly, those all came together. And when George Floyd was murdered and suddenly people were trying to figure out how to process it, we were able to have thousands of people together, including people who were not from those communities, to be a part of it. So, I mean, when you think about, for most people, the office is the most diverse environment they're likely to find themselves in. Neighborhoods are not diverse, schools are not diverse, places of worship are not. If you work at a big enough company, you're going to have people with different experiences and different backgrounds. To have an Asian employee talking about, after the wave of xenophobia and anti-Asian violence, that they were begging their mother to not go out to the grocery store, and doing that with 400 or 500 people all watching, that's an experience and a sort of heart-opening thing that you can't get in an in-person space when there's just not enough people there. So I think from a psychological safety and from an inclusion perspective and an equity perspective, that there's something really powerful about being able to create these deeper and broader connections, and that's something that leaves me optimistic for the future.
Optimistic. Fantastic answer. Chris, thank you so much. Thank you.
Next, for a panel on a people-centered digital revolution, please welcome Kelly Monahan, Director of the Future of Work at Meta, Miriam Vogel, President and CEO of Equal AI, with Susan Salney, contributor for Atlantic Live.
Good morning again, everyone, and thank you for being here. This is such an exciting topic at an exciting moment in time, because artificial intelligence systems are all around us, yes, but it's still early in the formative years of this technology, and that means it's an important time for us to build AI technology that doesn't hurt us so much as work for us and our values. Miriam, can you start by giving us a quick overview of how AI is already being used in the workforce, banking, and housing markets? in invisible ways that some of us might not even realize?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, and thank you for paying attention to this issue, all of you. One of the things that we do at Equal AI is help companies understand that they are now actually AI companies. They think of themselves as product and services companies, but they are using AI in their hiring and their HR functions. They are using it to make accommodations and improve accessibility and their innovation all across their enterprise. I think if you don't think you're using it at your company, or you think your friend is not using it, ask them if they've had some assistance in filtering through resumes and employee evaluations. Ask them if they've done a credit scoring. Some of you today might have used Waze. You might have last night enjoyed the algorithm selection on Netflix, Spotify. So I think, in short, there's very few places we are not benefiting from AI today, which is why this conversation is so important, to make sure it is benefiting us and not the other outlet.
The other way around.
Yeah.
Kelly?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in, and thank you for that. Thank you for having me on the panel today. I'm really excited about how we're using AI. I sit within our people analytics department within Meta, and for us, our values right now as we become a distributed first company is to making sure that we increase productivity, connection, and collaboration. And those things tend to be driven by invisible drivers and would take years as researchers to mine all the data. And so 3 quick examples just to make this very tangible of how we're using AI today. As we think about productivity, we hear loud and clear, meetings are a pain point. We have way too many meetings, there's Zoom fatigue. And so what we've done with AI is actually created a tool that allows for flexible meeting, where the AI-generated tool will actually pick a time that will increase focus time for you and making sure that that's when you work well. The second thing that's important is connection. Are we making sure that we still feel connected? The last panel, I think, hit on this quite a bit. And so for us, we get a lot of open-ended, unstructured text of how people are feeling and sentiment. Again, it would take a year for researchers to go through and manually code. With natural language processing, we're able to do this in real time and actually see how our workforce is feeling and where there might be friction points or barriers. Again, it's a huge asset to us as researchers. And then as we think about collaboration, trying to identify what is a team today, as we move beyond location and become distributed first, how do we actually work? And what AI has illuminated for us, it's often not a reporting structure of how work gets done in the system. And so AI has allowed us to identify the real teamwork and where the rubber meets the road of how work is getting done, and then form policies and programs that actually enable teams to work better together with less friction.
That sounds amazing. But at the same time, AI is often associated with fears that human workers are going to become obsolete and fears of job loss. Your research delves into this. Can you give us a sense of the future of work and whether you think human creativity has a chance against machine learning?
It's a great question. And I think this is where we can talk a little bit about what humans are really good at, which is generalized intelligence. And so, if anyone has kids or, siblings, a 5-year-old is going to be much more better at context switching, creativity, actually being able to apply knowledge in one domain and take it and apply it to another. And so as humans, we really have to ensure that we're doubling down on our generalized intelligence, connecting the dots, and ensuring that creativity moving forward. Now, AI is absolutely better at us at, specialized intelligence. And so its ability to stick within a context, as you mentioned, Netflix, the algorithm will only work for testing movies and TV preferences. It's not going to then be able to apply to the Waze app, as an example. So as humans, we've got to really continue to double down on our generalized intelligence, bring that context and judgment, and then really allow AI to alleviate that cognitive load we have in our workload.
Mm-hmm. Miriam, you said that AI will inevitably destroy some jobs, but it will also open up many new opportunities and growth sectors if we proceed correctly. So what should our country be doing now to reap the benefits of AI and avoid those pitfalls?
Well, thank you for asking that. It's absolutely true, as Kelly said, there is so much benefit from AI and there are absolute limits. And the more we are aware, the more we have digital literacy and awareness of what those limitations are, the safer we all are. First of all, as consumers, asking, have you tested for bias in your AI? Have you tested to make sure that I'm a use case that you envisioned and not going to be discriminated against in the AI that you're using? One example that I think helps demonstrate the distinction between humans and AI is great at keeping spam out of your email filter. It filters out so much junk mail that you just don't want. It will not understand why you want to filter out that spam. Humans need to be in the loop. We like to think of it as Equal AI as all the human touch points. That's because that's where bias and other risks can embed throughout the AI lifecycle, from early on and designing what that AI solution is going to look like. Who do you have in mind? Who did you forget to put in mind when you're thinking about what that solution looks like? If it's a hiring program, are you only imagining those you're currently hiring, your current leadership team, or are you imagining others who you'd also benefit, other age, geographic, and other demographic ideas, different viewpoints who would also benefit your team? Through the development phase, through the data collection where a lot of these biases embed, have you tested, have you thought about what data is in there, and continually iterating and testing, because AI will continue to iterate, and your testing needs to continue to test for these risks of bias and other harms as well. So what would I like us to do? I'd like us to ask that question. I think government needs to help establish the guardrails so that we can all be clear what is safe, what is okay, for a company to know if I'm acquiring an AI system today, if I'm building it, if I'm licensing it, what are my liabilities? What are you expecting of me? How am I supposed to document? How often, what, and using common verbiage so that we have understandable definitions that will be meaningful to others down the road. But we all have a role to play in ensuring that our AI is serving us and that it is inclusive and effective.
I'm so glad you brought up bias and equity. It's so important to keep that at the forefront because we're talking about something that has enormous scale and impact. And on that note, I want to go to your some of the testimony you gave in Congress. You testified in front of the U.S. House Committee on Financial Services and said this all-important detail, quote, decades of progress made and lives lost to promote equal opportunity can essentially be unwritten in a few lines of code, and the perpetrators of this disparity may not even realize the harm they're causing. I found that frightening. Can you explain more what you meant by that?
Absolutely. Well, again, back to the hiring function, because so many of us have either been hired or are hiring. I've talked to many companies who want to use AI to help increase their diversity, to get rid of human bias. And if built and tested appropriately, AI certainly can do that. The problem is, has it been tested? Have you asked, have you verified? Do you know that it has been tested against discriminatory outcomes? Do you know who the use cases were for whom it was designed and built? So, really when we're talking about life and death consequences, healthcare comes to mind. When you have use this AI system for an intake, do you know whether it has been built on a broad data set that has various demographics and various different peoples of different populations? Do you know if the patient in front of you is a part of that test group that has been universally tested and for whom the success rate has been documented? Or are they not? So in that case, you've got the doctor who might see a dermatological cancer finding, a recommendation from the AI as to whether or not it's likely or not cancerous, and not realize that the majority of the data sets it was trained on represent white males as opposed to the black female sitting in front of that doctor. The doctor has no idea that they have a false positive or false negative in front of them based on the patient in front of them.
Mm-hmm. There have been times when I've struggled to understand how exactly bias is perpetuated in AI, but correct me if I'm wrong, AI needs huge amounts of data. The data itself could be biased. The person coding the data could have unconscious bias. All of these various different human touch points are the issues. Do I have it right?
I think that's very much, at the end of the day, humans, we're the ones accountable and should making sure that we're using AI and algorithms in a way that's transparent and that we have diverse people coding at the table. And that's one of the best ways to alleviate some of that bias is making sure that we've got that diversity represented all the way at the start of that. And then I think another important thing as we think about the ethics of AI is to what intent? As coders, we can code and do things just because we can, but there's that human judgment element. And anytime that there's human judgment assigned, there needs to be governance and there needs to be accountability. What is right, what is wrong, and that's where the human intervention, the technology itself and algorithms benign, as is data, But the human side of it is where we've got to continue to run into issues in our history, and this is a chance to really course correct and get this one right.
So it seems like there's no substitute for human judgment, and that will be necessary to serve as an important check on AI. So that's one job we won't be losing, right? But the irony here is that it's only because of human input, that there is bias in AI, but then it's up to humans to make sure that they're a check on the bias in AI. So we're the problem and the solution.
It's a great way to say it, absolutely.
Interesting. Now, Miriam, you say that AI can be central to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. How? Can you talk about some of the best practices and accountability there?
Absolutely. So AI will not in itself be the problem or the solution. It can be part of both. It will be part of both in our modern AI world, our AI economy. One example that I think of that illustrates both the good and the bad stems from the fact that the same researcher has identified both the harms and the benefits. So Ziad Obermeyer had this seminal study looking at the algorithms used at the United Healthcare Optum services to identify patients that have additional needs, so they can proactively reach out to patients and offer additional healthcare services. So that's a great intent. The variable they overlooked is that they did a search for cost. Who costs the most to the company to provide services? And those were the population that they deemed those most worthy and needy of offering these services. Well, what this researcher and his team figured out is that that was a fatal flaw. The question they asked presented, identified, led to targeting discrimination that was embedded in the data sets. Well, it turns out historically, patients who are white and wealthy were offered more healthcare services than those who were Black and poor. As a result, the algorithm identified white wealthy patients as those who were worthy of having more healthcare services. On the flip side, he did another study where he looked at knee pain, where patients, and particularly patients of color, had been underdiagnosed in the severity of their knee pain. In that one, he went to the patients and asked them what their pain levels were and indications of where the pain was presenting. Well, it turns out the models were built on white males. Their pain symptoms, their pain points had been missed. So by working with the patients, working backwards, they were able to create an algorithm that was 2 times better at identifying pain, particularly in patients of color, but universally by being thoughtful about where are their embedded biases, in that case, in the historical biases that were embedded in the data sets.
Can we trust companies to self-regulate on this issue, or is legislation needed? And if so, what would it look like?
You can go first with that one.
It needs to be both. I mean, I truly mean it when I say we all have a place a role here. Consumers have so much power. Buyers have power in asking those from whom they're purchasing, licensing AI, have you tested for bias in your AI? Companies, at the end of the day, will have the vantage point under the proverbial black box of artificial intelligence. It will be up to them to decide, am I taking this on seriously? And if so, have they put in a responsible governance framework for their AI? We liken it to cyber 15 years ago, where companies didn't realize that when all the experts were saying you need to have a cybersecurity plan, it meant them. And if they waited, it would be too late. We're in a similar situation right now with AI, which gets back to the critical juncture you talk about, where so many of us are using AI. If you're using it in your company in a pivotal fashion, you need to have a framework. And likewise, we do need, as you mentioned, Kelly, we do need the government to help establish civil society to weigh in, and others. What are the guardrails? What are the normative values that we want to ensure our AI upholds?
Right, Kelly.
Yeah, and I think from a private sector perspective, it's been so interesting to watch this evolution. You know, I think when AI, first started, it was really focused on data scientists and coders. And I think what we're seeing at Meta is it's become much more about IO psychologists, behavioral psychologists, even neuroscientists, in trying to understand, for me, what is the human behavior implication and how will our human behavior change now that we have this newfound insight from, generation of insights generated from AI. And so that, to me, it requires a diversity of talent beyond just the data science function to really get this right and design it from the start with, again, to what end are we trying to solve for? If it's truly in that example you gave of cost, your algorithm will find that, but that might not be the most human-centered approach or actually what we're trying to go for. So for me, it's about making sure to what end, and it's more than just a financial or cost answer to that, and then making sure you've got the right people at the table who are seeing it from multiple angles.
The diversity in creating the code is so important. How do we get more diversity in coding? How do we fix the pipeline to the coding room?
Yeah, I think it starts with culture. I think we've got to, so again, my bias is always going to be I'm an organizational behaviorist, so I try to fix the environment. And so I think we've got to make the environment, whether it's underrepresented minorities, females, much more friendly and psychologically safe to enter into this world. STEM has obviously historically been white male. And so how do we make sure that we're creating the companies and environments that will attract all sorts of talent to be able to actually solve for the pipeline issue? And then obviously there's a whole other academic university conversation too, and making sure that we're attracting at that stage as well. But to me, it comes back to culture and making sure people feel included.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd have to agree. It's been interesting for me, my evolution coming from working in policy, working in law. I worked with the President's Equal Pay Task Force. I dealt with bias in the workplace, DOJ bias and implicit bias in federal law enforcement. I thought when we were talking about AI, it would be an entirely new equation, but it's the same old issue in a new medium. It's about culture. Do you feel part of the culture? Do you feel trusted? Do you feel trust? And the consumer as well. It's not just within the company. Does the consumer feel trust when they think about your brand, when they are using your products? So it's absolutely about culture, but I think we also need to do a lot more in creating access and interest in computer science and AI and STEM overall. We're leaving too much upon teachers to figure out on themselves this new language without giving them tools, without breaking it down for them. We need to show our future workforce, our future citizens, why they need to understand AI, why it is not an option to abstain, why it is a part of their daily lives. Doesn't mean everyone needs to be a coder, but it means they need to understand what this key part of their future economy will look like.
Right, at least have some exposure in the K through 12 experience to what it is.
Yeah.
So we're not graduating high school students who have no idea and have never taken a class in coding.
Yeah, and I think one more thing is something that you triggered that you said. I think this is where remote work becomes so important as part of that equation too. We know from the labor economics data that women with children in particular have been disproportionately exiting the market. And so the more that we can enable actually remote work, distributed first flexibility and choice, I think that's also going to be really key to attracting women and underrepresented minorities in this field as well. When it's centralized to a location, it's hard to disrupt people's personal lives in that way.
Right. Well, Kelly and Miriam, thank you so much for sharing your valuable insight. We have to leave it there today, but thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having us.
And now for a conversation produced by our underwriter KPMG on the power of the S in ESG, please welcome Zoe Thompson, Social Strategy Leader at KPMG, with Lisa Boyers, Senior Vice President of Marketing at The Atlantic.
Zoe, thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you.
It's great.
Well, we want to jump right in.
Yep.
Can you start to lay the groundwork for us for what ESG is?
Sure, absolutely. So ESG is a buzzword, for sure. If you haven't heard ESG, I'd be surprised. But it's also an acronym, and it stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance. And ESG is a framework. It's a framework to give investors so that investors understand a company's true impact and the risks and responsibilities that go along with serving the greater ecosystem. So, what that means exactly, E, environmental. That includes things like the carbon footprint, energy efficiency, deforestation, clean air, clean water. That's all under the E umbrella. The S, which is where I spend most of my time, is social. And that includes a lot of the stuff we've been talking about the last couple days, DEI, human rights, ethical supply chain, health equity, things that are really about the impact of companies on people and communities. And then finally, governance, which is really how do we operate. So that would include things such as executive compensation or board composite. This is different. So for a long time, people talked about CSR. They talked about corporate social responsibility. Now, that was a way for companies to say, hey, we really care about our communities, we're really involved. But for a long time, for a lot of companies, that meant Monday through Friday, they did their work. On Saturday, they would wear their company branded t-shirts, and they would go volunteer together. And that's how they did that. It was very separate. So a metaphor that I like to use, I don't know if any of y'all like to cook. I love to cook. And when I started cooking, and I would why do I need to put salt in the salt water when I boil my pasta? It doesn't make any sense. Why can't I just put it on at the end? Well, if you know how to cook, you know that you do that to get the salt into the pasta. And that is where we see ESG going. It's no longer just something you do separately. It's something that really needs to be part of your business strategy. It's embedded in how you do business.
Well, I love to cook too, and I put salt and water, the pasta water, into my pasta too, and it makes all the difference.
Yes, it does. It
sticks it all together.
Yeah.
So Zoe, tell us, is ESG a fad, or is it here to stay?
So that's a great question. And I think along with, is this a fad, we also hear, is this government overreach? And the answer to both of those is no, it's not. And here's why. So if you look at where the pressures are coming from ESG, they are coming from a variety of sources. So let's start with corporate investors. So beginning of this year, you had BlackRock, Fidelity, State Street saying, hey, we want to know what the composition of your board of directors. What does that look like? How diverse is it? Give us a sense of that. Be transparent. We're going to call you on it. So you have corporate investors. You have individual investors. You have people, especially, you find this to be somewhat generational, people saying, I want to invest in companies that align with my values. Well, how do I know if they align with my values? I go on their website. I read their 10Ks. I see what they actually are saying about their company. And I ask enough questions. You have activist investors as well. So you see a lot from the investor community. In addition, you see employees, and we've been talking a lot about this too, but current employees say, I want to work for companies that align with my values. Future employees say that as well, and they will call you on it. So you see that individuals, people as investors, people as employees, consumers, that consumers are also saying, and it has actually changed some markets where consumers have said it's important to me that the companies where I buy products and services align with my values. So you look at all this, and then you have the SEC. And you have the SEC saying, wait a second, there are risks. If our job is to ensure faith in the capital markets, I have to know what those risks are. And those risks could include not just financial risks, but also reputational risk. Are you using child labor? If so, you need to be transparent about that, because that's a problem. So the reason it's not a fad, and it's not, I mean, we do see there's obviously, a government element to it, but that's so secondary. That really a lot of the regulation reflects public sentiment more than it drives public sentiment. So the fact that it's being driven by so many different stakeholders, it's not going anywhere.
So Zoe, you talked about consumers as one of the key stakeholders here. So when I hear consumer, I hear business bottom line. And so my question to you is, as businesses are focusing more on people, how is that impacting business as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. What's really exciting, what I find incredibly exciting about where we are right now is that we're not changing the rules of business. Business is still business. Business is still about allocation of scarce resources, and it's still about figuring out how to make a profit. What we've changed with ESG, and this is what I find so exciting, is we're more transparent. That we're saying, you know what, there have always been costs. If you were polluting, if you were using underage labor, that was a cost. You just weren't always held accountable for it. So what we're doing now is we're having increased transparency, increased accountability, and really being much more open about the different risks and the different impacts. So from a business perspective, ESG is good business. And that is, if there's one takeaway I hope that people have is that ESG is good for communities, it's good for society, but it's also good for business.
Well, that's wonderful. So tell us a little bit about your role at KPMG.
So I drive social strategy. So my role is to help pull together different organizations within KPMG to go help our clients. So our clients come to us and say, I need to address this. And whether that is DEI or it's saying, what do I do to ensure that I am operating ethically? How do I make sure I have the policies in place? That's the role that we play. And so because of that, I'm in a lot of really interesting conversations with business. And what I find so fascinating right now is that we have what's happening in our classrooms, what's happening in our boardrooms, and what's happening in our living rooms seems somewhat at odds. And let me give you a couple of illustrations. So this last school year, 2021, 2022, there were 1,600 different book titles that were to be banned. That was almost 9 times the number of book titles that were banned 2 years prior.
Wow.
Huge, huge amounts. You see what's happening in the classrooms.
Yeah.
On the other side, you look at business, the Chief Diversity Officer role is right now the most hired role in corporate America and at the executive level. It's gone up, it was 111%, I think, increase. I don't mean people are hiring new people to fill. I mean, they're creating this role and they're putting people in it. So you've got what's happening in our classrooms, what's happening in corporate America. It's fascinating. Another illustration would be, so I live in Texas, I live in Houston. In February, Governor Abbott issued a directive that gender-affirming care should be investigated as possible child abuse. At the same time, we are getting calls from Fortune 500 companies saying, I have self-identification from my employees. Should I add non-binary? Should I have male, female, non-binary? So you look at this and look, well, what is the role of business? And I would argue and say that the role of business is now to help promote and encourage social change. And that's a really interesting dichotomy. Some might say that's a sign of a country divided, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree, but I think it's also a sign that just like with the cooking, you need to have the oil and the water, or in some cases, the water and the vinegar to really make things happen.
Oh, well, that's a great note to, I think, leave off on here. We really appreciate the time we've spent with you today. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Now, for a conversation about new measures for successful leadership, please welcome to the stage Constance Hadley, D.C. Marshall, and Bhumika Tharoor, Managing Editor at The Atlantic.
Thank you for joining us today, and let's just jump right in. So the phrase quiet quitting has gained a lot of traction lately. My colleague Derek Thompson has written about it in The Atlantic, and before we jump into our conversation, I'd love to hear from both of you what that phrase means to you.
I read Derek Thompson's article, which was very thought-provoking and provocative on this topic. And I think you raised some points of view I would echo, which is that, first of all, what is dangerous about the term quiet quitting is that it becomes kind of a rallying cry for creating tension and conflict in organizations. And I'm seeing this in the media and in conversations that I have with executives, this idea that, oh, it's been confirmed workers are lazy and they will take any opportunity they can to just kind of hang out and stay on the job without doing real effort and commitment. And on the other hand, we have workers saying, yes, it's about time that we told those employers that they can't run our lives anymore. We demand more flexibility and free time in our work. And it just doesn't seem productive to be focusing on it as a tension between the senior people and the more junior people in an organization. Now, that being said, I think what it does relate to is some really difficult decisions that people are making right now coming out of the pandemic about where does work sit in their life and how much are they willing to give for it. And I'd like to continue to have those conversations and have organizations engage with employees in that. There's something called the psychological contract that employers have with employees, and I think it's what we're doing. We're renegotiating the psychological contract of work right now. So rather than jump to name calling or aspersions on either side, let's have more of a real talk.
Yeah. Dee, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, and I will, I'll echo some of what you shared. So quiet quitting, I think two thoughts. So one, now when we hear new terms in workplace culture, the respectful thing to do is always to believe good intent, but always to track back to, well, where did that come from? Who was the source? So that's always with whatever it is that you hear, and then you can get a better frame. So that's one thought. Thinking about where. And now I will tell you my thought, and I've shared this. If anybody listened to the Brown Table Talk podcast with Mita Malik and DC Marshall, well, we talked about it on the show. This is really about talent, respecting boundaries. Is it really quiet quitting, or is it really you just protecting your space, your family, who you are, your loves, you're balancing your time? And so I see some up. Yep, I got some snaps in the back. It's really, and I think I love the frame of just holding positive space for, no, we're not going to say people are lazy. That's canceled. So calling people or a particular generation lazy, no, let's call things by their right name. And by their right name, when people are opting out and no longer available, what is that? We're just managing boundaries. So
when I'm going to dig into that concept a bit more later. But first, I want to acknowledge that this is a really big moment for companies and for workers, especially reflecting back on the pandemic, early stages of the pandemic. And I'd love to hear both of you, if you could explain the changes that you've seen in leadership and what's now considered to be successful.
Well, I think one of the really positive aspects that came out of the pandemic is a recognition that leaders hold more than just the responsibility for the work products of their people in the organization. They actually have responsibility for the employees themselves too, in a broader way. When I think about what makes for an effective team, the first thing is you do want to do a good job for the stakeholders that receive your goods and services. But you also want to think about, is everybody here learning and growing? Is everyone supported in that effort? And is there enough positive interpersonal relationships in this organization and team so that the people can flourish beyond just getting that job done? And I think we're seeing, I haven't seen it hit too many scoreboards of CEO ratings yet, but I think we're starting to see moving to that direction, like responsibility for the health, the emotional health, the mental health, and the social health of their organizations.
Yeah, and I will add, so a number of things. So one, it is inclusive leadership. So now the new rules of leadership is you have to be able to lead through a multicultural lens or through a multidimensional lens. Why? A number of reasons. So one, the largest demographic in the US is millennial. They are 73 million over boomers who are 70 million. So millennials are not now, you no longer really need to tease them out or call them out because that would be othering. No, they are it. They are 37%. You like that? Millennials. You are, they're it. But they make up 37% of the workforce, so they're the largest population of the workforce, so they're it. And then also the largest domestic emerging market is 51% people of color. And so what does that mean for business and for leaders? You have to be able to lead through a multi-dimensional lens. So that's one, inclusive leadership, those new rules. Number two, leaders needing now to revisit systems of barriers, not just diversity and inclusion, but really looking at systems and policies that really will get you in trouble now by sustainability requirements. So the previous conversation was about ESG, and the S within ESG deals with social, and there is discriminatory, reporting now that happens, and so leaders are now held accountable, going to be held accountable for looking at systems that perpetuate systems of racism in terms of pay, and so that would be another. And then the third is protecting psychological safety. Leaders have a responsibility now to make sure that we do no harm. And I know those were in the previous panel. So those would be the three things, that we are sharing with our clients, and we work with most of the Fortune or many of the Fortune 500.
That's great. And Dee, actually, I'd love to hear from you and understand a little bit more about soft skills and how can we evaluate if they're working?
Yeah, so good question. So soft skills in corporate, we say EQ, right? Emotional intelligence. In fact, there's a powerful quote by Dan Goleman, and it says, 80% of success is attributable to emotional intelligence. 80% of success is attributable to emotional intelligence. And so how do you measure emotional intelligence? I think by your people. Right? So if your talent was able to evaluate and review, if it was the reversed in terms of performance appraisals, your people will show you whether or not you have, that you get it, right? The way that you are able to lead people, guide people, attract engage and retain your people, it is based on not your hard skills, not your technical skills, but your ability to lead, your ability to deliver.
Right. And Connie, I know you've done a lot of research on loneliness at work. And I'd love to hear about the signs and the responsibility that the workplace has to address loneliness at work.
Actually, I'll start with a quote from a CEO that I was presenting to about the terrible impact on people when they're lonely at work, which is far more common than most understand. It has severe physical debilitating effects that are correlated with it. It's been equated to the same morbidity risk of being obese or smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So that's one issue, and that can be translated to healthcare costs as well as just the human impact. But the other aspect of it is that people aren't doing their best work. It's really hard to engage when you feel disconnected or not supported by others at work. But the CEO quote was, after I presented all these reasons why you should care, he said, you know, I can see why it's a problem, but I don't see why it's my responsibility to fix it. And this goes back to this issue of what are we holding our leaders accountable for? What matters? And I paused. I was meeting with the CEO and his executive team. And I said, well, I don't know that it's your obligation to fix this, but I don't know why you wouldn't take the opportunity to do so. And there was another comment from another senior leader who spoke up, being very psychologically safe in a tough room, and said, you know, I want to just say, I need to work on this for my people. I think it's really affecting my workforce. We're losing people. Going back to the quiet quitting, I don't think people are fully engaged. And if they had stronger relationships and didn't feel perhaps what they now realize might be loneliness, we could be a lot more effective.
Yeah, and I mean, what you're saying reflects on this moment of profound grief and loss and stress that a lot of employees faced specifically early in the pandemic that in some ways carries on. And then you have companies that are beholden to moving the company forward and maximizing profits. And, you know, how should leaders think about reconciling these two realities? I'd love to hear from you first, Dee.
I need to think about that.
Yeah.
I'd like to give it some thought, but, you know, I will say the need now, and I'm going to say this from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, or actually, no, I'm going to say this from a growth perspective, because in many ways, in fact, I think this came from an executive over at Nielsen. If companies today don't have a solid diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy that is working, and where they have either measurable results, significant impact, or they're making bold moves, they don't have a growth strategy. And so I would say prioritizing people and culture, diversity, equity, and inclusion is where you find cognitive diversity, which is where you find innovation. And so I think that's one of the biggest drivers in terms of reconciliation of running a profitable business. It's understanding largest domestic emerging market, understanding that we are at D&I 3.0, reprioritize race and culture, having that strategy be a priority as a way to cognitive diversity to drive innovation.
Connie, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll say two things. One, I think there is really no discrepancy between profitability and success in a lot of these ideas, because you will get the most out of your workforce. You will have engaged people who want to stick around and do their best work. But on the other hand, I also want to acknowledge there's a wonderful article that came out during the pandemic by Robin Ely of Harvard Business School and David Thomas of Morehouse College. The title of the article was Getting Serious About Diversity, Enough Already with the Business Case. So part of me also wants to say, there is a business case. Let me show you that in one slide, but now can we also talk about why you should do this even if there weren't? And I think that organizations carry such power in our lives and in our society that I would like to see them feel that this is something that they should do even if there might be some sort of short-term margin hit from doing so.
Yeah, and in the last few years, it feels like we've seen more diversity in higher profile positions. Is it your view that the path to the C-suite is clearer now? Whoever wants to take that first. Dean seems to have quite a reaction.
No, I mean, I'm processing. What's the question?
So is it your? We've noticed that there have been more announcements of people of color in high-profile positions lately. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that the pathway to C-suite is clearer now?
Oh, I don't know about that. I will tell you this. There has been a trend. In fact, I was interviewed and I spoke on this. There was a trend immediately after last election. Leaders took a copy and a page out of our chief commander. We started to see a trend. The number 2 person in the country is a person of color. And so there was a trend there. Mm-hmm. I think also because of the diversity tipping point, which is the period beginning May of 2020, when corporate acknowledged we are anti-racism and Black Lives, air quotes, do matter, and begin very intentionally investing and really interested in supporting Black communities and then Latinx communities, you saw then some shifts in hiring and creating seats. Very comparable to D&I 2.0 that reprioritized gender, that was as a result of #MeToo when women then were in those states. So do you see it's a very similar trend?
Right.
So do I think it's there's a path? No, I think that there's some things happening. Sometimes we say Black folks are on brand or people of color are on brand. There's a trend happening because of a number of things. And so, yeah. And I'll give you this last stat. It was on the last panel about chief diversity officers. Chief diversity officers' tenure in their role pre-COVID was 3 years. Now it's a year and a half. So they don't stay. It's an undervalued, underappreciated role. They take the hit for everything. So as soon as a corporation or CEO says something, is a diversity fail, the DEI person has to then come in and fix it. So, yeah. I hope that's helpful. I know it's sometimes what people don't want to hear, but I think it's great to just hear, broader perspectives and just get really real with what's really happening.
Absolutely. Yeah. Connie, I want to get your thoughts on, as we move, there's a lot of work to be done, and as we move towards a future where there is more diversity, particularly in senior leadership at companies, obviously there's a lot of responsibilities that senior leaders have in terms of setting culture and incentives and being deliberate. But do the rest of the employees and the rest of the workforce have any kind of obligation in these conversations?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. First of all, they can also be a way of holding leaders accountable with their voices. But did I just lose my mic? I'll try to talk loud. But they also, I'm going to do something?
Just project.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just project. Okay. So they can hold their employees accountable is one way that they can get involved. But also, every single person in an organization is responsible to each other, up, down, sideways, about creating that culture of inclusion and belonging. And so it is not the job of the chief diversity officer. Formerly, it was the job of the chief human resource officer to make sure everybody was included. This is something that everyone needs to play a part in, and really being aware and asking questions to find out your impact is so important that we do. So I'll give you a quick example from my own life. I speak a lot about psychological safety, which is the belief that this is a group where it's safe to take risks without repercussions, negative repercussions. And I was doing a leadership training with public school leaders yesterday in Texas. And there was a group of about 40 people in the room, and I was doing some cold calls, trying to get the group, talking. And someone came up to me at the break and said, "Did you realize that the first 3 people you called on were white?" And I felt like a punch to the gut, because I was trying so hard to be inclusive and recognize the diversity in the room, yet somewhere in the back of my brain, I saw white people first before the people of color in the room. And it was terrifying and horrifying to be in that position, but thank goodness that person told me. And I had allowed them the possibility of telling me that because I started out the whole session setting norms. Norms about, I want to hear from you. This is not a one-way conversation. And this is an opportunity for us all to learn and grow together. And I think that's the reason that person felt comfortable doing it. So every single person, if you're in a meeting, if you run a meeting, if you have a small team or a big team, there are ways that you can contribute to a sense of inclusion. And you should assume that you're probably not doing it perfectly.
That's really, thank you. Oh,
and let me add this as a final. So this, I love that you shared that, Connie, and that somebody was, shared that with you. But I would say as an actionable even takeaway for leaders, since we're talking about this, is that's one of the first action items in our training around allyship, advocacy, or D&I champions, is that you first just become aware, track over the next 7 to 10 days where your own bias shows up, because it doesn't necessarily need to it didn't come from an evil place. It's it's called a blinder, a blind spot. It's the Johari window. It's just something that you couldn't see. It wasn't evil intent behind it. But I would say that's the work that leaders should do, is let me work first on awareness of how I'm showing up, who's in the room, and I did connect, or I met at this event all of the people who look like me versus someone who does not. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing. We'll now take some questions from the audience. I think there's a mic somewhere. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Hi, Al Scott. I do thought leadership at Allstate, and it's a very interesting panel, and the whole morning has been terrific. There was a question posed in the first panel with the CEO of Indeed about what word should replace hybrid. And I thought with your experience, it would be interesting to hear what you would think about that. Thank you.
Do you have thoughts on that?
I don't know. I do study hybrid work, and it's been frustrating. I'll add to the course for new terms. For me, that hybrid can refer to simultaneous mixed modes. So a team can be hybrid if some people are in Europe and the Middle East and some people are in the US, and you're having a meeting with different people in the room versus on video. But it also can mean hybrid in alternating modes, where I'm in the office one day and I work from home. So that alone bothers me as a scientist. It's so imprecise. But in terms of thinking about the impact on people, maybe we need to be thinking more about naming the type of work that gets done where, and that might perhaps give us some new categories of people. So we might say that there are, on-site creative collaborators that's the kind of work that they do, and then we have other people who have more, thinking work that requires more execution, solo, like Derek talked about, how as a writer, working from home is something most writers already do, because it's usually the best way to get that work done. So something about the type of work gets done and the timing of alternation would be helpful, I think, but I don't have the right terms yet. Great, thank you. Other questions?
If there isn't another question, I hope there's another question. And so while you're waiting, I'll add. I don't have a response for hybrid, but I like when the question is asked. I have meaning in terms of new language, because I do believe, the work that we do at Diverse and Engage, our 30,000-foot vision is really to help create a world where people can better connect, communicate, and respect unique differences. But so the word that I'm trying to help us manage is BIPOC, right? But I respectfully know that it came from, I think we sourced it back to millennials. Okay, they had great intent. But for me, it just sounds dismissive and it's not inclusive. You know why? It says Black, Indigenous, and then all those other people of color. Do you see how that feels? And how many of you here are in the room, you're of color, right? You don't identify as white, you may not identify as Black, right? And so again, it continues to perpetuate. And so can we just have time to say, if I am Cuban American, if I'm Portuguese, if I'm Russian, or however, clap for that. And so it leaves space. So, but I know it was well intended. We use it. So I didn't have a word to replace hybrid, but I would like us to think about when we're replacing, does it further perpetuate othering and systems of oppression? So that's what we're trying to solve. Now, when we go into corporate, if you use BIPOC, we will share that, but we also always try to make it a learning experience. When you do those other people over there, it's just that doesn't. Do you mind me? I identify as a Black woman. Do you mind me asking how you identify?
As Indian American.
Awesome. Do you mind me asking how you identify?
I identify as white.
There you go.
Yeah.
Do you see?
Yeah. Well, this has been really insightful. Thank you so much, Dee and Connie, for your insights here and illuminating conversation.
Thank you.
Let's give another round of applause for our speakers. Thank you for joining us. Grab something to eat, and please be sure to join us at 2:30 p.m. at the Mead Center for American Theater, right down that way, other end of the wharf, for our Ideas Stage programming. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you again to KPMG for making the conversation possible.